Mrs. Weffler was saying how interesting it was, the type of exercise it took to seat everyone. And I think that's sort of appropriate for the conversation that we're about to have. We are going to hear from Dr. Ben Powers. He works at the Southport School, pretty far away. It's about an hour and 5 minutes to get here, so we're very grateful. He lives in Madison, so you might see him around town. He's going to talk to us about neurodiversity. I know I sent a little video around, and so you may have watched that and got a little sneak preview. But Dr. Powers is a researcher, practitioner, and advocate who works with students with dyslexia and ADHD. And one of our topics that we talked about earlier this year with Idea Day, with diversity, there's lots of different types of diversity, right? We look at diversity of skin color, diversity of religion. We talked about, and this is another form of diversity. I was thinking, blanking on diversity around the world, where you come from. So we are so pleased and honored and lucky that we get to hear a little bit about this type of diversity and, again, looking at problems in unique and different ways because we don't all think alike. Our brains don't all work the same way, probably. I mean, I think you're going to help us figure out if that's true or not. But that's what I think. I know everybody might handle a puzzle differently, and I think it's so exciting to be able to hear from an expert in this area. So without further ado, he'll tell you a little bit more about himself. Could you help me welcome Dr. Benjamin Powers?
Thank you so much. Happy Friday, everybody. You guys excited it's the weekend? Yeah, me too. So I work in Southport. It's about an hour from here, but I live right here in town. And I do a lot of different things, but my favorite part of the day is that I work in a school that's specifically for kids with dyslexia and ADHD. And so most of these kids at my school have had a pretty hard time in school before they came to us. Most of them either had trouble with reading or writing or spelling or attention, and maybe didn't have the best time. Maybe sometimes they got really frustrated or upset in school. And so my favorite part of the day is when the kids come in the morning, because they want to come to school, because we just do things very differently at our school. We try to find a way to work with each kid in a way that works with them. And so that's what I do during the day. And then I also am a researcher at a lab at Yale. So if you know where Yale University is in New Haven, I'm a researcher there. We do some imaging research. I'm going to talk about that today. All right? So here we go. I'm just going to tell you a little bit about me. So this is the plan. I'm going to give you a little background on me. We're going to do a little neuroscience. Does anybody know what neuroscience is? What's neuroscience?
It's like the study of the brain, sort of.
Awesome answer. Yes, exactly. You're studying the brain and really thinking about the nervous system and the way that our neurons work in our brain. So yes, really, really good answer. So we're going to talk a little bit about neuroscience. I'm going to give you a little more background about me. I'm going to save one piece that's really important. And then we're going to talk about the average. What does it mean when we say average? Who can tell me? What's average? Back here.
Average is kind of like normal, standard. That's basically the definition.
All right, very good. Yeah, so when we think about average, some people might say normal or typical or in kind of the middle. And standard is another kind of way people often think about average, is like, what's the standard? So we're going to talk about the average for a minute, and then I'm going to talk about some examples of neurodiversity and cerebrodiversity, and then the why. Why do these things exist? All right? So my background, does that sound okay to everybody? We're good? All right, good. All right, so this is me, and you can't really see, it's a little blurred out, but on my right-hand side, that's me with my 4 kids. I've got 4 children. And if anybody knows William or Nick and William know my kids very well. I have a son, Chase. I have a daughter, Skylar, a daughter, Reese, and a daughter, Zoe. And we live right off of Neck Road in town here. And so I've got those 4 kids. And then I also have 125 kids at my school. I've been the head of school there for 10 years now, 11 years. And we have 125 kids who come from all over. We have a girl who comes on the bus almost 2 hours each way every day to come to my school because she has dyslexia and they couldn't teach her the right way in her school how to read, write, and spell. So she gets on the bus every day, drives 2 hours into school and then 2 hours home. It's pretty crazy, right? Yeah, so my hour drive is not so bad. So So like I said, I run this school, I'm at a research lab at Yale, and then I also run a center at a place called the Yale Child Studies Center, and we do global literacy work. So we work in places like, right now we have a big project in Buenos Aires. Does anybody know where that is? Buenos Aires? Yes, Argentina, good. Argentina, we're working with some kids who have like no access really to school, and we're helping them learn how to read. And then I also am the president of an organization called the Dyslexia Foundation, and it's a research think tank. Every 2 years we get researchers from all over the world together to think about really challenging problems around reading, writing, and spelling. And so that's pretty much what I do during my day, and then at night I hang out with my kids, and we've got 2 crazy cats who like to terrorize our house and our neighbors, and that keeps me very, very busy. So that's a little background about me, and now I want to talk a little bit about neuroscience. And so we already got a really great definition of neuroscience. It's thinking about the brain and the nerves and the neurons. Where does this word come from? Neuro. Does anybody know neuro? What that means? Oh, hold on. I'm going to go over here. Oh, you want to?
Neuro means brain, I'm assuming.
Okay, it does have to do with the brain.
The neurons in your brain?
Very good. Yeah, we're talking about the neurons in the brain. And so this word neuro comes from Greek. If you don't know, most of our language actually, when you hit like 5th grade, 4th, 5th grade textbooks, most of our language that you're reading is either Latin or Greek based. And so the root neuro actually comes from ancient Greek. And let's see, I can read these to you because you probably can't see them that well. But this root neuro means tendon or cord or even bowstring. This is how it was used way back in ancient Greece. But it also means nerve. And so when we're talking about neuroscience, we're really talking about our nervous system and the neurons in our brains and studying those things. And so that's what we do at that research lab that I work at. We have a lot of different projects where we do research around this. Oh, good, there we go. Okay, so neuroscience is the study of how the nervous system develops, its structures, what it does, and neuroscientists focus on the brain and its impact on behavior and cognitive functions. What's cognitive mean? What what cognitive means? Cognitive, oh.
Like understanding and like how people understand.
I don't know what you guys are teaching here, but your students are really, really smart. Yes, exactly right. Cognition, thought, the brain, it has to do with thinking and understanding. If your cognition is really the process of thinking and understanding. And so, why do you think we do this? Why do you think we want to study these things? Why is it important? Who cares, right? We get up, we get dressed, we go to school, we come home, or go to work or whatever. Why should we waste our time studying the brain?
Like it's like every person has a different brain and how it works.
Every person has a different brain and how it works. It's exactly right. Even though we all have a brain and the structures are the same, every single human brain is unique. It's like a snowflake, right? Everyone is absolutely unique. And so that's why we study them, because that's what we're here to talk about. Because every brain is unique, there is diversity, there's differences, right, across the brain. And so it's really, really important to understand these things, both so we can figure out how people can live a healthier, happier, more successful life, so we can help them, or just to see kind of what we can think about, or what kinds of challenges or problems or questions we can solve. And so this is, I think some of you may have gotten some videos around, oh, sorry, we'll do this slide too. So we talked about neurodiversity. The other kind of diversity, and the way I frame it, is called cerebrodiversity. And they're really very similar things. But when we're talking about cerebrodiversity, with neurodiversity, we're talking about the neurons. With cerebrodiversity, we're specifically talking about what's called the cerebrum. And that's the largest part of the brain. And I think all of you, or many of you, got some videos or learned a little bit about the brain. Is that right? Okay.
Hopefully everyone watched it, but some did, and some may follow up after.
Okay, good. So I'm just going to cover very quickly what this looks like. But the cerebrum, that part of the brain, it's responsible for thinking. It's responsible for things like your ability to walk, talk, smell, your feeling when you touch things, emotions, right? Like if you're happy or sad, it does a lot of different important things. What could happen if somebody was having trouble with one of those things? What might we do? Somebody was having trouble with like their emotions. They were getting too upset, or they were getting they were unhappy. What could we do? What could that person do? How could they get help?
You could like go to a doctor or talk to their parents about something, and they might be able to help.
Exactly right. Yeah, you go talk to somebody, right? A parent, a doctor. And again, that's why we do this kind of work. We study this so that when somebody needs help, if somebody's having trouble regulating their emotions, we can help them through neuroscience to help the doctors understand what are some ways we can do that. Because sometimes that might be through talking. Sometimes it might be things like medication. Who knows about, and who's heard ADHD? Raise your hand if you've ever heard of ADHD. Wow, right? All the hands go up. Who can tell me a medication that might help somebody who has ADHD?
I think there's 3, but the 2 that I remember are Vyvanse and Adderall. They work in different ways.
That's exactly right. There are some different classes of ADHD medications. One class that's a stimulant, means it stimulates you, like caffeine, like you drink soda or coffee, like has caffeine in it. There's stimulant medication like Adderall or Vyvanse. And the way we know these things work is because what do we use? We use neuroscience. We study what is happening in the brain, and we can actually see, is that medication doing what it is supposed to do? So that's why this work is really important. It helps us, it can help make a really big impact. And so here's the cerebrum. This is what we just talked about. There are 4 main parts that we think about. There's the frontal lobe, the temporal lobe, the parietal lobe, and the occipital lobe. Where do you think your frontal lobe is? Right in the front, right? Frontal lobe is really, really important. It's like the CEO, like the chief executive officer of your brain. It does a lot of our things that help things like plan and organize or execute a task, like to be able to do a task. Frontal lobe is really important. Let's say somebody like had an accident, they fell down, they hit their head, and they damaged it. What might happen?
It could damage the frontal lobe.
Exactly, it could damage the frontal lobe, and then maybe that person wouldn't be able to do some of those things. And so we have researchers who research these things using neuroscience to figure out how we might help. Do you have a question?
If they damage their head and like it hurts their brain, they can have problems with their brain and stuff.
That's exactly right. Yeah, if you hurt your brain, you can have a problem with it. And so that's why we do this kind of research. Some of the people we work with at our lab have had damage. And so we help and figure out what are things we could do to help them maybe regain some of those things. Like one thing that sometimes we have people who come in, they've lost part of their memory or their ability to store information. And so we have things we can do to help them kind of rebuild that memory so that the rest of their life they don't have to be struggling with their memory. So exactly right. So those are 4 main parts, and you can't read this unfortunately, but and can I give you these slides when I'm done? Good, and you can see. So the important thing to know here is that each one of these areas has specialization. And so we just talked about the frontal lobe, things like planning and organizing, the CEO of the brain. But the whole brain has to work together, right? It's like, if you think about a team, maybe you have one person, like in soccer, a forward might score your goals, right? But you aren't going to win the game unless you have somebody on defense. So the brain's the same way. You have areas of specialization, but the whole brain has to work together to make it work. And so this is the lab that I'm at. It's called Haskins. And what we are a group of neuroscientists, cognitive scientists, and we said cognition has to do with thinking, geneticists. Who knows what a geneticist is? No?
Geneticist studies genes.
Exactly. What's a gene? You know? Anybody else want to guess or take a stab at it?
Seventh grade. You better not be guessing.
Jean, 7th grade.
You don't have to answer. Just pass it down to who's in the blue shirt. Yeah. Sorry, take a risk.
In the section of DNA that determines a trait.
Yeah. That's very good. Very good.
Yeah, did you understand that? Basically, very good answer. I love it. Thank you. Our genes are basically what help us determine it can be as simple as like hair color, eye color. Our genes determine a lot of pieces of who we are. Now, just because you have a gene for something doesn't mean you're actually going to have that trait. We get genes from our parents, and so we can carry a gene for something, but we might not actually. It's not determinantal. We might not actually have that trait. And so, one of the reasons we have geneticists at our lab is because there are actually genes for things like dyslexia. There are over 50 different genes associated with dyslexia. And just because you have one of those genes doesn't mean you're going to have dyslexia. But if you do have that gene, you are more likely to have dyslexia. And so we have geneticists, and then we have education researchers. And education researchers are the least exciting of this whole group because we study how people learn in thinking about instruction in classrooms and those things. It's not as exciting as the neuroscientists, but it's still a lot of fun. And so the group, we all work together to think about how can we make educational experiences better for kids, especially around spoken and written language, how we communicate. All right. So these are, you can't see this, unfortunately, but these are 3 key parts of what we're thinking about when we're thinking about typical and neurodiverse types of learners. Did you guys learn about any specific populations of people who are neurodiverse? Any groups? We talked about dyslexia already a little bit. 2 other groups.
Autism, ADHD, dyslexia.
Dyspraxia.
Dyspraxia, very good.
Yeah, do you have another one?
Pass down.
Tourette's syndrome.
That's right.
Thank you. There are actually a lot of categories. Yeah, you have another one.
Down syndrome.
Okay, so Down syndrome is another example of having a diverse brain, right? So we can have a lot of different components of neurodiversity. The 3 main categories that I'm going to focus on today are autism, ADHD, and dyslexia. So dyslexia, we talked a little bit about dyslexia, but who can remind everybody, what does it mean if you have dyslexia? What do you have trouble with? It's the orange jacket.
You have a harder time reading.
That's right, reading. Anything else?
Writing.
Writing, good.
Spelling.
There you go, yeah.
Reading, writing, spelling. Dyslexia means you have trouble reading, writing, spelling. It means you have trouble reading, writing, and spelling in spite of being able to do it based on your cognitive ability. It means that it's not for a reason like nobody ever taught you, or because your brain is just not functioning properly. It's because there's some challenge is blocking your ability to read, write, and spell. And so people with dyslexia have a really, really hard time where? Everybody? School. School is not too much fun for somebody with dyslexia. And it's somewhere between about 7 to 12% of the population has dyslexia. And that's worldwide. Doesn't matter whether we're here in the United States or in China, does not matter. Somewhere between 7 to 12% of school-aged children have dyslexia. It is the most common type of learning disability. About 70% of students who get special education in the United States have dyslexia, so most common. What about ADHD? Who knows anything about ADHD? Nick?
It gives you difficulty difficulty with attention, and well, there are two types. One of them also has to do with hyperactivity, while the other one is a little more inactive in that area.
Excellent answer. Yes, there are two main types of ADHD. There's ADHD. There's ADHD inattentive type, means you may have trouble sustaining your attention, or completing a task, or being organized, or even starting a task. And then there's ADHD hyperactive, and that means, what does it mean to be hyperactive?
It means that you're really hyper and you always want to run around and get up and run around the room and do laps everywhere.
Yeah, it means you have more, it might have a good way to think about maybe some more energy. You like to move a lot, right? That's ADHD hyperactive type. And then there is a third type of ADHD, and these are my favorite types of ADHD people. They are both inattentive and hyperactive, right? Okay, so that's kind of the third type. So that's ADHD. And then let's talk about autism. Who knows what autism is?
It's like when you have like a problem focusing.
You might have a problem focusing with autism, and it's important to know that you might have autism and something like ADHD, right? So you might have a problem of focusing, especially if we're doing things like talking, right? Who else knows something about autism?
Doesn't it have, if you have autism, don't you have some issue communicating with other people?
Exactly right. Autism really, at its base, is a challenge with communication. And so it might be in terms of using language, is an excellent answer, and social interaction, like reading body language or clues. And so these are, that's really can make it hard for people in school too, right? If you are having trouble communicating, or you can't really tell what somebody is looking to do in a conversation.
Autism is also like difficulty with like strong sensory related things like loud noises and certain like textures and stuff like that. And it's also things like not like having greater like hyper-focusing. This is also something with ADHD, but like hyper-focusing more on things that you tend to be interested in, and also like reading social cues.
Yes, excellent. That's all excellent. Exactly right. Reading social cues. Maybe hyper-fixating on something like a subject matter, or sensory issues. Sensory, like, some things maybe a feeling, like something you touch might be bothering you, or something you smell might bother you. You ever have that where you don't like the way something feels when you touch it, or something doesn't smell really good? Somebody with autism may have that, but like on a really high level. Like, it's not just that it bothers them a little bit, like it really bothers them to the point where they can't think about anything else, right? And so that speaks to hyperfixation, that hyper-focus piece. They're really, really focused on it. So that can be another attribute of somebody with autism. All right, so those are really kind of three main things that we study at Haskins. And so I'm going to show you how, and hopefully you can see this. It's a little bit hard to see, but I'm going to show you one of the main ways we do this. It's called fMRI. And an fMRI is a machine that basically we can stick somebody's head in it. You can't really see it, but there's like a table, and then there's this big kind of circular piece, and basically it's a huge magnet. And what it does is it takes pictures of our brains and really thin layers. Before we had these machines, the only way we could really study the brain was doing dissection, right? And so what used to happen at a place like Haskins is when people would die, they would agree to donate their brain to science, and the scientists in the lab would literally slice them into little thin sections to be able to study them and to see our brains different. But now we have to do that, and it's actually much better for a lot of reasons. It's not just, the lab smells a lot better for sure, but it's also, now we can study people who are alive, and so we know they have something like dyslexia or autism or ADHD, and we put them in this machine, and basically it is a gigantic magnet, and you can kind of hear it whirs, it spins around, and it's magnetic because it's looking to detect something that's happening in our brain. So when we're using a part of our brain for a task or an activity, what do you think gets sent there to make sure that it has enough of what it needs to do that job? You can just yell it out if you want.
Electricity.
Yeah, a kind of electricity, yes, kind of, exactly. What, in what form, how does it get there? What do
I
we,
have a question.
yeah,
So, like, usually, like, isn't it like you get diagnosed like dyslexia or ADHD? They don't usually do an MRI.
that's right, and I'll explain why in a second. It's a really good question.
So yeah, I was just confused on that. I don't have an answer to your question though.
So when we're doing something with our brain, it has to send, it needs energy. And so what gives us energy, one of the things that gives us energy is oxygen, right? We need oxygenated blood. And so when it sends this oxygenated blood there, there's iron in our blood. And what do you think that magnet detects? Iron, right? That's really what's happening. And so we can look at these little thin slices. And so, I'm sorry, what was your name? Will. Will just asked a really good question. When you get diagnosed with something like ADHD or dyslexia, you don't usually get an fMRI, and the answer is no. And the reason is the technology, we can't diagnose somebody with an fMRI. And I'm going to show you what like a brain scan looks like. When we see a brain scan, like the one I'm about to show you, it's not one person. It's multiple people's brains that have kind of been put together so we can see patterns of areas of activation in the brain. And so the technology is not quite there yet. It's also super expensive. Getting an fMRI is expensive. It's not easy. There are not a lot of these machines. Even at the lab, like we have to wait to be able to use the fMRI for a study. There's like a wait list. And sometimes they need them for people with actual problems, not just research. And so the researchers come after the people who actually might need them for their health. And so it's not the easiest thing. And again, we just don't have, the technology is not quite there yet. It'll be there someday, but not quite yet. So that's what an fMRI does. Okay. And again, you'll see this in the slide, but basically this is a slide that shows like, here's an activity. Ooh, go back one. Here's an activity. The things we do in the fMRI are really simple. They're like tasks. And usually there's like a little button you push. And so in this task, basically like if you see an arrow pointing in one direction, you push the button. If you see an arrow pointing in the other direction, don't push the button. And what we want to see is, what's happening, how fast does it take to push the button? Are people pushing the button when they're not supposed to be? And so this was a study that was done, and you can't see these brains unfortunately, but what you would have seen here is the brains of the kids with ADHD and the brains of the kids with ASD, autism spectrum disorder, we're seeing different areas of activation in the brain. Their brains are literally using different areas to solve the same task. And that's because we're neurodiverse, brains are different. And within these subsets, like autism or ADHD or dyslexia, we see patterns of difference. And sometimes that causes a challenge, right? Like with reading, writing, or spelling, but sometimes it creates an advantage. And that's what we're gonna talk about in a minute. All right. You can't see this one either, unfortunately, but you see that kid in the blue shirt there with the stripes? That's me when I was in second grade. So this is the second part of my background. So I have ADHD. Want to guess what kind? Hyperactive, impulsive, or combined? Combined, yeah, very good answer. I have ADHD combined type, and I take something called Adderall. It's part of what helps me keep focused. I take that in the morning when I wake up. It's something that really can help me keep focused during the day. Something like Adderall or medication isn't the right thing for everybody. For me, it actually really helps me stay focused. Because I do, without my Adderall, I have a lot of energy, more energy than you would normally see in me. Nick might see that because I don't take it on the weekends, so you might see that right there. But part of the reason I'm able to take that medication is because of all this great neuroscience that's been done. But I will tell you, how do you think school is like for me? Hard, yeah. And you probably can't read this. Yeah, that's me. This was like, I have some comments here on my report card, but I really struggled in school, especially early on. I struggled to learn to read. People with ADHD may often have trouble learning to read, in part because it's hard to remember or it's hard to maintain attention. And so I had a tough time, and so I got like pulled out for a reading group. You know what I mean? Like you have like it's called a pull out, and they pull you out, and you don't learn to read with your class, you learn to read in like a small classroom setting. And then also, I had trouble with things like word attack, which is your ability to see a word on a page and figure out what it says. With comprehension, like I might get through a book, but I really couldn't tell you what it meant. I'd have to reread things many, many times to make sense of them. So that made every assignment pretty hard for me. And so that's pretty frustrating when you have to like read the same thing over and over again. So school was not the easiest for me. And by the time I got to high school, and you can't see it because that's the left-hand side of the screen, it's all blurred out, but by the time I got to high school, teachers were saying things about me like, needs to improve study habits, needs to work harder, needs to study daily, not just for tests. And here's the thing, I was actually doing those things, but it wasn't easy for me. And it took me a lot longer. And so I would study and study, and then I would go in and I would take a test, and I wouldn't do so well. And what would the teacher say? You should study. And I would go home and be like, I did. And guess what? After a while, what do you stop doing? You stop studying because it doesn't work, right? And so by the time I graduated high school, I was really trying to figure out whether college was the right thing for me. That was a big question. Like, do I really want to keep going to school? I ended up really learning to love school. College was really great for me. And I went and got a doctoral degree, which is even more school. And so I learned to find ways that school worked for me. And that's a really important thing for people who are neurodiverse or cerebrodiverse. You have to find ways that work for you. All right, so why didn't school work for me though? Because I'm not what? I'm not average, right? I have combined type ADHD, I'm not average. And that's okay, right? I actually now run a school, and you notice I run like a lot of different things, I have a lot of different jobs. Guess why? Because I'm ADHD, I have all this energy, I can split my time and attention and focus, right? So that's a distinct advantage for me. And I just want to show you, has anybody ever heard of a bell curve? Yeah, okay, you've heard of a bell curve? Basically, a bell curve shows us where people might fall. In the middle part, you see that it says 34.1%? That's those two sections, that's the average, that's the in the middle. So that's 68.2%. That's where most people fall. And then you see at the very tails on either end, it's a very small number of people, right? My ADHD is so bad in certain parts that if you go out from the zero, see that -1? That's called one standard deviation away. So between the -1 and the 1, that's average, okay? Between the -1 and the -2, that's 2 standard deviations outside of average. That's most of the population, okay? 3 standard deviations outside of the average in some of my ADHD, okay? They gave me a test, that test I talked about where you had to click the button. I performed the worst possible score, okay? Because I have a real hard time inhibiting. It's called inhibiting. Like when I see something, I press the button. Doesn't matter which arrow it is or not. And you can tell me time and time again, I keep pressing the button. It's not that I don't know what to do. It's that I have a little bit of a difficult time between seeing something and making a decision about what to do with it. And that's why that medication, for me, is really helpful. And so that's just another example of something that happens with ADHD. But so this is a bell curve, and you can see not everybody's going to be average, right? Maybe most people are, but not everybody. And I'm going to show you a quick video. But this video is about the 1950s. Okay, we were looking to develop new aircraft, fighter planes. The U.S. Air Force was looking to create new fighter planes because we were not doing very well with the fighter planes we had. The government decided, the Air Force said, we got to build some new planes. We're going to make them the best planes. And to make them the best planes, we are going to design the cockpit. What's the cockpit? Who sits there? Pilot, right? We're going to design the cockpit. We're going to do the biggest study ever done of human body types, of all pilots, or most, as many pilots as we can get, and figure out what would be the best way to design the cockpit. So you say, we're going to, how tall, how short, legs, arm length, right? Like how far they need to be away from the yoke, which is how you fly the plane, right? And we're going to take all those measurements, and what are we going to calculate? The average, right? So don't say it out loud, but I want you to think what they did this, okay? And they built this fighter plane off of all this research they did based on the average. And I want you to take a guess in your heads, and then you're going to watch the video. What percentage of the fighter pilots fit that average? What percentage fit the average in the cockpit? Okay, just think about that for yourselves, all right?
For a while, they blamed the pilots. They even blamed the technology. They eventually got around to blaming the flight instructors. But it turned out that the problem was actually with the cockpit. Let me explain. Imagine you're a fighter pilot. You're operating a machine that in some cases could travel faster than the speed of sound. And where issues between success and failure, sometimes life and death, can be measured in split seconds. If you're a fighter pilot, you know that your performance depends fundamentally on the fit between you and your cockpit. Because after all, what good is the best technology in the world if you can't reach the critical instruments when you need them the most? But this presents a challenge for the Air Force, because obviously pilots are not the same size. So the issue is, how do you design one cockpit that can fit the most individuals? For a long time, it was assumed that you could do this by designing for the average pilot. That almost seems intuitively right. If you design something that fit for the average sized person, wouldn't it fit most people? It seems right, but it's actually wrong. And 60 years ago, an Air Force researcher, Gilbert Daniels, proved to the world just how wrong this really is and what it was costing us. Here's how he did it. He studied over 4,000 pilots, and he measured them on 10 dimensions of size. And he asked a very simple question. How many of these pilots are average on all 10 dimensions? The assumption was that most of them would be. Do you know how many really were? 0. Gilbert Daniels proved there was no such thing as an average pilot. Instead, what he found was that every single pilot had what we call a jagged size profile, right? It means no one's at the same on every dimension. And this makes sense. Just because you're the tallest person doesn't mean you're the heaviest. Doesn't mean you have the broadest shoulders or the longest torso. But this is tricky because if every pilot has a jagged size profile and you design a cockpit on average, you've literally designed it for nobody. So the Air Force realized they had a problem. And their response was bold. They banned the average. Meaning that moving forward, they refused to buy fighter jets where the cockpit was designed for an average-sized pilot. And instead, they demanded that the companies who built these planes design them to the edges of dimensions of size. Meaning that rather than design for, say, the average height, they wanted a cockpit that could accommodate as close to the shortest pilot and the tallest pilot as the technology would allow. Now, the companies that made these planes, as you could imagine, weren't happy. Right? They argued and lobbied, and they said it's going to be impossible, or at least impossibly expensive, to build a flexible cockpit. But once they realized that the Air Force wasn't going to budge, suddenly it was possible. And it turned out it wasn't that expensive. And in fact, they made great strides, leveraging simple solutions that we all take for granted in our everyday lives, like adjustable seats. And as a...
All right. So what's interesting here, right? How many people actually fit average? 0. Yeah. We can put things in that average category, but every one of us has a jagged profile like that. It's not just about our body's shapes or our height. It's not just about that. It's about our brains too. We might have a real strength in our memory, right? We might have like a really strong memory, but we might be slower at processing information, like really thinking about when information comes into our brains. but maybe you have a high score in one area and a lower score in another area, and it looks what? It looks average. And so, but actually, none of us are really average. And so that's what's so interesting about all of this to me. And the second thing is, what came out of this for us? What changed as a result of this kind of thing? Now, I know none of you drive, right, yet, but if you ever see somebody who's really tall get into the driver's seat of a car, how does somebody who's really short then drive that car? If their legs aren't nearly as long, what can they do?
Adjust the seat.
Yeah, they can adjust the seat, right? It's not that hard, right? And we've been able to do that for a long time now. I mean, now it's usually like, electric, right? When I was a kid growing up, we had windows that we rolled down manually. We had to adjust the seat the same way, but now it's electric. It's super simple. Or now you get in a car and it's maybe preset, like it knows one person versus another person, and it just automatically adjusts. Doesn't just adjust the seat, it adjusts, what other things does it adjust,
Steering wheel, yeah.
The height.
Height, steering wheel, front, back. Yeah, what do you got for me over there? Yep, you might know what you like, your preference, right? And that's another important thing. You might have a different preference, right? Somebody might want a heated seat, somebody might not want the heated seat. What does the driver look at to see if any cars are behind them?
Mirror, yeah.
Mirror.
Mirrors, right. If you raise the seat and the mirror is now too lower, you can't see. And so you have to adjust the mirror. So we need these things. And what's interesting is it's because of these kinds of circumstances, because of differences like this, that we actually all benefit. And I just want to give you a couple of examples of that. ADHD, we talked about all these kind of, it's hard, it's struggle, right? Researchers have figured out that it's because of ADHD people, very likely, that we migrated as humans, that we migrated from to all these different places around the world, because people with ADHD can't sit still. They're looking, they need novel experiences, they need to go out. And this was actually an advantage. Way, way back, this was a huge advantage for us because we needed to find new places to live. Populations were getting bigger, more people, we needed food sources, maybe weather was changing, and so we needed people with ADHD who could explore, be explorers, right? And so there are definite reasons why this neurodiversity exists, why things like ADHD or dyslexia or autism exist. And so there are parts of why these things benefit society. I will tell you right now, if you were in the safari, right? If you were in the safari in Africa, and there were wild beasts roaming around you, you want the ADHD person with you, because they are going to be the first person, likely, that is going to spot the lion before it eats you, right? Because they're kind of looking around, they're seeking new kind of inputs, right? That's an ADHD person. And so there's a reason, there's an evolutionary reason why these things exist. And researchers can figure out through things like genetic studies, and that's how they figured this out. There are genes for ADHD people. They've gone back, they figured out, looking at migration patterns, they've looked at these genes and they figured this out. There was a higher incidence of migratory people who were carrying these markers for ADHD. Autism. Somebody in the back said this about being hyper-fixated, right? Autism was one of the reasons why, as a species, we were able to start to specialize in things, because people with autism could be hyper-focused on, and if you've ever met somebody with autism, one trait can be that they can be really interested in a particular subject. That actually has helped us evolve as a species to be able to specialize in things. And so it can actually enhance our ability as a community. We need people that specialize in things. We also need people that don't specialize in things, right? So it's all about that balance. I'm gonna give you one more example about dyslexia. I've been working with kids with dyslexia for 24, 25 years now, specifically with dyslexia. Also ADHD, but all the kids I've worked with since I really first got out of school have had dyslexia. And what's been interesting for me to meet all these different people with dyslexia, some of them had a really hard time in school, but did really amazing things. Who knows who Richard Branson is? You ever hear of him? Richard Branson? You know who Richard Branson is?
I know, but I don't know anything about him. I've just heard the name.
He is like super successful. He runs a company called Virgin. They have like Virgin Airlines, Virgin Mobile. He has a massive amount of money. He's been very, very successful. And it's not to say that money is what defines success, but he's built a huge empire, a huge business. He has really bad dyslexia. School was really hard for him, but he figured ways around it. Because he figured ways around it, he was successful in business, that anytime he was in business and something bad happened, what did he figure out how to do? Figure a way around it. So I want to talk, you can't really see him in this tree here. I want to talk about my friend Pete. So my friend Pete lives out in Oregon. He lives in Portland. And Pete's about 10 years older than I am. And Pete has very, very severe dyslexia. He cannot read very easily at all. And when I say he cannot read easily, so he's in his mid-50s, he probably reads at a third grade level, okay? Almost everything Pete reads is something he listens to, okay? Audiobooks, or his computer reads to him. So Pete has severe dyslexia. Do you think he felt good about that growing up? No. Nope. Did not feel good at all. And do you think he wanted to tell people? Nope. He did not want to tell people. So Pete didn't tell anybody about his dyslexia. His parents knew. His parents figured it out. And people in his school knew, but he didn't want to tell any of his friends or anybody else. And when Pete was in his early 20s, he got into an accident. He was jumping, and that's the reason I have the picture of him here with the tree. And he landed the wrong way, and he hurt his back really badly. And now Pete is a quadriplegic. He's in a wheelchair, okay? Because he had this accident, he figured, you know what? Everybody now sees me in a wheelchair. I can share that I have dyslexia with people. He wasn't embarrassed to share it anymore. And he is now the only research scientist at Intel. He's a research scientist at Intel. He's the only one without a PhD, without a doctoral degree. There's a special place at Intel called Intel Labs, and he's one of about 50 or so research scientists there. And his job is to design things way off into the future. I've gotten a chance to go out there. It is unbelievably cool. One example of something he and his team developed was a device firefighters could throw into a fire that could instantly give them all this feedback on things like what chemicals might be in there, what are the temperatures, what are the oxygen levels, right? All these different things, like a little hockey puck they could just toss right in there. He's got this other project right now. He's got this very cool carpet they've designed that's like fully interactive with you. It's very, very cool stuff. It's stuff that you will experience like 10, 15 years down the line. He's doing a lot of stuff with stuff like artificial intelligence, all this cool stuff. But the reason I want to talk about Pete is because Pete's life was so difficult in school. And when he hit his 20s and he had this unfortunate accident, it became difficult for him physically to get around. He made a very important decision in his life. Very important. You can either choose to be upset about it, right, or frustrated or feel angry, or you can just figure out, like, what are the strengths? What are the opportunities I have? What did Pete do? Opportunities, yeah. It didn't happen overnight. It took him a little while. But once he embraced that, he decided he was going to use his experience as somebody with dyslexia and somebody who is in a wheelchair all the time to make the world a better place through working at Intel. I want to give you a really crazy example. We were at a conference together, and we had a meeting. We decided to go out to breakfast right before the conference started. Now, people with ADHD are sometimes late. I am typically usually late to things. And so I don't have the best sense of time. So I'm not the best person to keep an eye on the clock. We're sitting there at breakfast, and I don't notice what time it is, and we have 10 minutes now to get from breakfast to the conference. And it turns out the conference is like a 20-minute trip away, like a walk. We're in the city, and so we really kind of had to walk. Pete, what's Pete in? What do you see there? He's in a wheelchair. Pete's wheelchair is really fast. Pete was like, well, I'm not going to be late. He rolled right out, and Pete like flew right down. He's just made the best of it, right? He's turned what is a disadvantage into an advantage for him. And he was on time. We were all late. Pete was on time. Pete has traveled all over the world, and what he attests his success to is hard work. Okay, he works really hard. Pete works harder than anybody else I know. Okay, here's a guy who has no use of his arms or his legs. Okay, and he fabricates things on his own with like a 3D printer, and he's got plasma cutter, and he's got all this cool stuff. He's got the coolest apartment I have ever seen in my entire life. It's awesome, and he's built most of the things that are in there. He's figured out ways around to be able to be successful and independent. Being prepared, he talks really about being prepared, and how that's important that is. Empathy, what's empathy? Who knows what empathy is? Somebody's empathetic.
Putting yourself in somebody else's shoes.
Really good answer, yes. Your ability to put yourself in somebody else's shoes and have feelings for that person, right? Pete is one of the most empathetic people I have ever met. He's so empathetic. He's always trying to put himself in other people's shoes. And so that's a really important characteristic. And he ended up getting very interested and going back to school for graphic design and visual design. And what he does now is he's a UX designer, which is like the user experience designer. So he thinks about not just what kinds of products we need, but how we might want to interact with them. What is going to make something a better interaction for us? So, anybody ever hear of Stephen Hawking? Do you know who that's Stephen Hawking? Does anybody know who this guy is?
Didn't he like work with something like in space or something? Like he helped with like space stuff?
He did a lot. He was a mathematician, okay? And he did a lot of focus on exactly that. He did a lot of focus on like really complicated mathematics. Does anybody else know anything about Stephen Hawking?
Isn't he like the smartest person in the world or something?
Yeah, people thought he was probably one of the smartest people, right? I mean, he was super, super smart.
On his 53rd birthday, his wife and kids took him to a zero gravity place, and he got to float around a tube for about 5 hours.
That is awesome. Yeah. It turns out, Stephen Hawking did just some groundbreaking mathematical work. He was so smart. Unfortunately, he passed away a few years ago. Pete became very, very good friends with Stephen. Very good friends. And so Pete was tasked to be the designer of Stephen Hawking's communication equipment. So the crazy equipment that Stephen Hawking used, because Stephen could not, my friend Pete is actually, relative to Stephen Hawking's abilities at the time, my friend Pete had more capacity to be able to do things and move. Like Stephen Hawking really could not move very much at all, and had a really hard time communicating. And so my buddy Pete was hired to lead the team to redesign his communications equipment. Why? What do you think? Yeah, that's right. He had a similar problem, so he could put himself in his shoes a little bit, have that empathy we talked about, right? He's a hard worker. He knows about user design. And I'll give you a really simple example. One of the things that really, really bothered Stephen Hawking, if you're in a wheelchair and you can't really move, who can you really never see? People behind you, right? So my friend Pete, so Stephen said, this is one of the biggest things I'd like to solve in this next round of like, how can I figure this out? Can you project like a video? My friend Pete solved that problem in about 60 seconds. You know what he did? Yeah, he took he found a little piece of mirror and he had it put on. So it solved this problem in like 2 seconds, exactly. Because he could put himself in those shoes, because physically he had similar experience. And also, he was able to put himself in that situation from that perspective. The other thing is, guess what type of neurodiversity Stephen Hawking had? Dyslexia. He had a really, really difficult time learning to read. One of the smartest people who solved all these complicated math problems struggled, failed to learn to read in school. In fact, they had to pull him out of one school and bring him into another school because he was having so much difficulty reading, just like my friend Pete. And so they could share that kind of similar experience. And what's interesting is the technology that my friend Pete and his team helped design for somebody like Stephen Hawking, we all benefit from that. because it's really expensive to design that kind of technology. But then once you do, then you can share it with other people and it's not nearly as expensive anymore. And so that's how my friend Pete looks at his job. He says, the things that help improve my life, make my life easier, actually may make things easier, like Siri. Who ever uses Siri for dictation, or Alexa? Why do we have that technology? Why do we have speech recognition? For people who can't what?
Like read or communicate well?
Yeah, so people who, they can't write, right? And they have, but they can recognize the speech and it will write it down for them. That's right, that's a huge advantage. And so, but now everybody benefits from it, right? Or maybe, but we can use it. And so it's opportunities like that. That's one of the huge values of neurodiversity, all right? So here's the end, right? Okay, important. Again, sorry you can't read this. But human variation, is it a bad thing or a good thing? Is being different bad or good? It's definitely good. We would not survive as a species. We wouldn't have done things like migrated. We wouldn't have the technologies we do. We wouldn't have people specialized in fields like medicine or science or things that actually help us live longer or live a much more fulfilling life if we didn't have things like neurodiversity. Are people average, or does everybody have some type of jagged profile? Jagged, right? We all have a jagged profile. There's not one typical or quote-unquote normal, I really don't like that word normal, but typical or normal person. Everybody has variation. Everybody, and everybody's brain is different. We know this through all this imaging technology. What's this next one say? Why do we do research on it? Why is it important that we do research on it? So we can do what? You say that one. Help other people, right? Figure it out, help other people. Why do we have these things? What can we do to support them? We also know that neurodiversity can offer those distinct advantages, right? It doesn't mean it's easier for that person. It doesn't mean, that everything's better because everybody has a jagged profile. So some of the challenges, like we talked about with autism, some of the communication pieces, right? It's more challenging, but the specialization is a huge benefit. So it's a jagged profile for everybody, but it does offer distinct advantages. And I think most importantly is that when we think about all of these different types of people, we all have the ability, all of us have the ability to create an environment that can help support each other and create that sense of belonging and inclusion and really help people who might have a more jagged profile with some greater areas of deficit or challenge and some greater areas of strength, feel like they're part of the community too and be recognized for what value they can contribute. We can all create that because we all have the possibility to create, whether it's technology or systems, to help everybody be successful and for everybody to contribute meaningfully to our community. And so that's the most important thing to me. That's why I go to work every day, is because I love being in a place where every kid who walks through our door, whether it's at my school or at our lab, feels like they are actively and authentically contributing positively, because all of us have contributions to make. We all have a distinct advantage of our own in that jagged profile that makes everyone else's life in this room a better thing. So that's what I wanted to share. So thank you so much.
Dr. Powers, thank you for this. I like especially the question about the environments in which the more different we are, because my life has been enriched by the more I work with people who are different from me. And it takes you out from thinking you're the center of the world, you're average, everyone else is maybe somewhere in the elliptical. We're all jagged, we're all happily jagged. And our community will continue to grow the more we embrace that jaggedness and welcome others. So, you are now officially part of the country school community. Go ahead, Ben.
Do you have questions? Does anyone have a question? I know it's like getting late and it's time for dismissal. I think what we'll do is if you do have questions, we'll write them down. Our advisory can collect them, and then maybe we can follow up that way because Dr. Powers lives in Madison. He's a neighbor. Nick can carry back and forth the questions, right? Or did he already have to scoop? But anyway, we'll make sure we keep in touch. We'd love to have him back here again, and he
Thanks for having me.